start now. I guess everyone is coming. Yeah. It's becoming a marvelous evening altogether. Thanks to you again, to you all, and to our speakers. Now our third speaker is a very precious person, Dr. Brian Johnson, who is the pioneering researcher at our Society for the Neuropsychoanalytical Treatment of Addictions. And he is going to talk about the neuropsychoanalysis of it in addictions. So, here he comes.
Oops, this is, it's not tall enough for me. So, anyway, thank you all, you survivors of the conference. Is this okay? Too loud. Okay. Is this better? Great. Okay. Oh. How about this? I can feel like Madonna. Okay, so I hope my American accent is understandable, and I know that your brains are worn out from listening to the first two speakers who are so brilliant that you have to run your brain at full speed every minute while they're talking. I have an easier topic, I hope, and that is practical. What do you do with all this neuroscience thinking? How would you use it to actually treat a patient? Does it make any difference whatsoever? Suppose you're a clinical psychologist and you have a patient with an addiction. Can you just throw this all out? Would it be better to try to tune in emotionally to your patient, to listen carefully to what they're saying, and skip the neuroscience part? So if that's the question, I'll try to answer it. The general situation for me is I was at Harvard Medical School for 30 years, and as you're hearing from the first two speakers, taking a neuropsychoanalytic perspective in what you're doing causes a great deal of friction with colleagues. So I am trying to do what Mao did so successfully. You abandon the cities, you move to the countryside, and you develop your army there. So I left Harvard in 2008, and I moved to State University in New York, where I have unqualified acceptance and backing, and I am free to do as I please. I've created a neuropsychoanalytic addiction service. It runs with medical students and psychiatry residents. We sneak in a few psychologists, but there are licensing organizations that would put us out of business if we ever officially had a psychologist working on a medical service. It's the difficulty of doing this kind of thing. And we're really fulfilling the promise of neuropsychoanalysis. Our service is wildly popular at the hospital. I speak on every service, even orthopedic surgery. Our concepts, because they're biologically based, seem to appeal to all the other doctors. In 2011, we had 2,570 outpatient visits. We do consults every day. We're constantly getting referrals, obviously. So if you stop being an idealist and you anchor your thinking in biology, as I learned from Mark and Jaak, suddenly you're no longer isolated. Suddenly you're there with everybody else. Suddenly your ideas compete on a level ground with people who do all kinds of the same or related work. So it's been an enormously successful approach to take. If you had me here in a year, I would give you an outcome study from our service, because one of the things about moving from being a psychoanalyst, having my patient lie on the couch 5 days a week, to being in an academic setting is I can put proposals through the institutional review board, get my research sanctioned, and then be able to generate statistical results that I could never do in a case like you're going to hear. So I apologize that the science is weak, and I'm going to plunge in and make sure that I don't go on too long, because your brain's already shot. So I'll take that into account. Okay, here's Mark explaining that we're not trying to get biology to replace psychology. This is the dual aspect monism that Jaak mentioned about 5 times. It's a beautiful thing if you think about it, and I've learned this from these two. You can use the neuroscience, and you have one vantage point to observe behavior, and you can observe empathically, maybe using some of the mirror neurons, but I'm sure it's much more complicated than that. We do tune into our patients, but I believe I'll illustrate in this case, if you don't use your neuroscience understanding, your treatment is not going to work. So here's why. I picked for this particular conference, I've published about alcohol dependence, about heroin dependence, about marijuana dependence. I picked cocaine for this conference because the neural circuitry is better understood than I think for any other addiction. And it has to do with changing the seeking system. So I know the neuroscience is very difficult. I was speaking to a couple students earlier who were perplexed. So I prepared 3 levels of slide. This is, I obviously studied with Rembrandt, Picasso in my drawing. So you can see my beautiful drawing of a brain here. And this is the most basic picture of what the seeking system is. This is cheating because I stole this slide from Mark and obviously reproduced it poorly. It's not well, the XY axis is off, but you can see that the ventral tegmental area is at the top of the midbrain, and then there are basal forebrain pathways that go through the hypothalamus where many things are tuned. Your interest in sex or eating or drinking water, and probably relationships and drugs would be tuned there. It goes to the nucleus accumbens shell, and then it goes to other sites that you see. And this is my favorite picture, and it may be everyone here's least favorite picture. It's a cartoon of these same sites, but you can see the ventral tegmental area is at the center, and there's a dopaminergic pathway that goes southeast from the ventral tegmentum to the nucleus accumbens shell, and an important neurotransmitter there is dopamine. The nucleus accumbens shell is going to use glutamate, so you're hearing all these terms that you heard from Jaak, so I hope you're hearing them the second time. And it signals the prefrontal cortex, and then a downgoing glutamatergic pathway goes back to the ventral tegmental area, and it's a reverberating system. So information is generated by, suppose you use cocaine. Now, why does the coca plant make cocaine? As probably everyone knows, it's a natural insecticide. That's what's in it for the plant. So if you were an insect, it would damage your brain. If you're a human, it might damage your brain too. It would cause some changes here. So cocaine blocks the dopamine reuptake transporter protein as well as other reuptake proteins. And instead of the dopamine being recycled, it tickles the nucleus accumbens shell it gets recycled back into the presynaptic neuron. The cocaine blocks that. So dopamine just fires and fires and fires, and there's a signal that something very important has happened. The first time people use cocaine, I don't know if it's positive or negative, but it turns on this circuit. And then information reverberates so that you remember it, you remember who you bought it from, what things looked like at the time, and a few exposures, maybe even one exposure, and you will urgently want cocaine for the whole rest of your life. So that's the nature of the neurotransmitter alterations that are caused by this poison, this insecticide, which is sold here in Istanbul as well as the United States. How do I know? I talked to my bartender. So he told me all about buying cocaine in Istanbul. I am going to mention very briefly that there are two pathways. There's an upper pathway, so methamphetamine and nicotine will feed into this, and it makes them the hardest addictions to stop. There's also a downer pathway where I've written opioids here. They work by a different mechanism. This is a braking system. There's a tonic brake on the VTA, and when you take the brake off, the VTA fires too quickly. So this would be the mechanism for the downer drugs, benzodiazepines, opioids, alcohol, marijuana, but they're not as addicting. They require more exposures, and you find social users of these drugs with more frequency. Anyway, that's the hardest part, I hope, of the whole talk, and I apologize if you didn't get this part. All right, and now we're going to go on to what psychoanalysts do. This is stealing from Freud. He started with the neuroscience, as I've heard from Mark many times now. He was a neuroscientist for 20 years, and then he switched into treating patients. So he brought his neural models. So I'm now going to give a model. I don't insist that it's reality. I think these guys would argue with me if you could stay up long enough to listen to the debate. But I'm going to use as my model that the pathway that I just showed you is Freud's drive pathway. So what I'm going to say, and you should read Neuropsychoanalysis. It's a terrific journal. Beautiful articles constantly, including by these guys, but I have a couple, and one of them gives more neuroscience about drive and cathexis and how addiction would cause a new kind of cathexis to drugs by repeated gratification. This was Freud's idea. People who feed us, or if you feed your dog or your cat, they start to have strong positive feelings for you. If the drug dealer is selling you cocaine and exciting this pathway, bizarrely, even though the dealer is selling you something that could kill you, you start to have strong positive feelings for this person. You want to go back to them over and over again. So we're going to say that cocaine and maybe all addictive drugs create a new drive. That's why they're so awful. I have a book that describes the addictive drug industry. It's extremely lucrative. It's about the size of the oil and gas industry in the world. And they have a product to sell which changes your brain and makes you want this product insanely for the whole rest of your life. So cocaine is going to be that kind of a drug. And the seeking system then is going to be more powerful than some of these other systems. There's going to be become an imbalance. Almost like mania, you're going to start to urgently, crazily want this drug. It's going to be in conflict with some of these other systems, but there's an imbalance, which I'll mention some animal evidence for in a minute. So the reverse tolerance is the idea that frighteningly, less and less exposure turns on craving. And eventually, people in Alcoholics Anonymous, for example, will say that one drink and you're back to drinking a liter of vodka a day, and it probably has something to do with reverse tolerance. You've changed your brain with the alcohol. Now, I don't want to be simplistic. I have another paper that describes the difference between physical and psychological addiction. I think they're two completely different things. So developmentally, teenagers are having a hard time with relationships and with separating from their parents, and drugs are the magic cure. You can have 6 beers and you can dance with anyone. You just take one oxycodone, as Jaak was describing with the rats, and you can kiss a boy or kiss a girl and you don't worry about it so much. You do coke and you can feel like you're in the middle of a superhero movie. Your seeking system is turned on. So whatever it looks like from the outside, you feel like you're James Bond, you know, chasing everything, and it's a fabulous feeling if you're 12 or 16. By the time you're the age you guys are, you would know better. I doubt anyone here is doing coke. You can tell me afterward if you are. So I'm not going to go through the psychology of this, but there is a very important psychology to getting started. Once you're started, the brain changes take over. All right, so the middle bullet here is, oh God, I'm blocking on the guy's name. Jaak probably knows. What? No, it's the guy who's the head of NIMH now, I think. Anyway, it doesn't matter. He did a very nice study where it's one of these T setups, so the rats at the bottom of the T, their pups are at one side, and the cocaine administration is at the other side, and it's hormonally determined when they're under the aegis of some of the care systems that Jaak was talking about. They will go to their pups, and I guess, I don't know rat development like Jaak, but apparently by 16 the kids are older, and the mother would rather go to the coke side. So they're competing systems neurobiologically as well as psychologically. Jaak said I would say something about autism, but I can't say it until Athens when I talk about the opioid system, and tonight is for cocaine. All right, so let me tell you now about a patient, and this is the very abbreviated case presentation, but I had a reputation in Boston as where you go when everything is failing. So I was referred a patient at about age 40 who was injecting cocaine, and she had been to the best treatment that there is in the United States. She had started to use it since age 15. She'd been sober for 3 years, going to Alcoholics Anonymous all the time. She had gone to a hypnotist to stop smoking cigarettes, and after she had relapsed to using cocaine, strangely, the suggestion that she stop cigarettes worked for cocaine, not cigarettes. So she continued to drink alcoholically, use marijuana addictively, smoke cigarettes, but she stopped cocaine for a while. She got in trouble with her drinking. DUI is American abbreviation for driving under the influence. So she was drunk driving. She got arrested, and she met a man who was in psychoanalysis, or eventually was in psychoanalysis with one of my colleagues. And he was the straightest, most disciplinary, authoritative man ever. So she decided the solution would be she didn't have to give up the drinking. She just had to get married to this guy because he would keep her in line. That was the theory. And they had a couple of kids, and almost like the rat mothers that I described earlier, when her children got to be a few years old, she met someone, and he had coke, and she realized they could do coke and have sex, and she could get away with it, and things spiraled downward from there. She started to inject cocaine all the time. Hazelden is where the movie stars and football players in the United States go for recovery. She went for a month. She came home and immediately used coke. She went for another month, and she came home and immediately used coke. So the precipitating event was her husband looked at her arm. He saw the track marks from injecting the cocaine, and he said, either you go to see Johnson or we're getting divorced and I'm taking the children. At the time she arrived, she was on an antidepressant called bupropion. She was on another antidepressant, venlafaxine. The first one is noradrenergic and dopaminergic. The second one is, at this dose, mostly a serotonin drug. Clonazepam is a benzodiazepine that's cross-tolerant with alcohol. And dexmethylphenidate is very cocaine-like in its action. So she had the sort of usual double-O doc approach to pharmacology when she arrived. Now, double-O doc is sort of like 007 has a license to kill, and so did her psychiatrist. All right, her father was addicted, and her parents had gotten divorced when she was 1 year old. And so she managed to have sexual abuse from her real father and verbal and physical abuse from her stepfather, and it was probably like the kind of cases that you guys see all the time. Addiction is never a thing that people decide to do because they're happy and it's a lot of fun. It's usually a desperate attempt to try to function when so many things have gone bad for you. Her initial mental status was that she had attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. The study that I'm working on right this minute, about 50% of the addicted patients who we put through opioid detox on my service had ADHD. It's amazingly, amazingly high. Her Hamilton rating scale for depression score was 12. This is dysthymia. And of course, you never know, was it the cocaine? Was it she was half depressed all the time? She had trouble with relationships. And the model on our service, and it's based on Yak's thinking, is you get depressed when you're unrelated. And boy, was she unrelated. We always test very carefully for cognitive dysfunction. We do a very sensitive screen because drugs are horrific in terms of what they do to people's brains. But her screen was perfect. So the initial change in medicine was she was taken off the venlafaxine as non-contributory. Bupropion was increased to 450. And of course, she was told not to use potentially addictive drugs. All right, so how did I organize my thinking? We all know that as psychoanalysts, we have very conscious ideas about what we're doing with our patients, and they're probably wrong. We probably don't know half of what we're doing or saying with our patients. So I humbly submit that I can only give you my version of what went on in this treatment. But I, at the time, was sitting behind the patient and taking verbatim notes. So instead of deciding consciously or directly what I thought happened, I went back and read 60 hours of notes. And I had a classification system. One was, what are my neuropsychoanalytic interpretations? What are regular old psychoanalytic interpretations? I have a thing, I'm going to skip this slide, but Yak referred to it earlier Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous are some of the best organizations in the world. They save more lives than the United Nations and Doctors Without Borders combined. So, and it has to do with relatedness. If you can't relate to people, you can't do much with these meetings. So, given that the patient was injecting cocaine, which meant she could be dead any day, this became a idea. The way we present it on my service now is most people who have good recovery go to Alcoholics Anonymous. Why wouldn't you? And it's really a question. I mean, do you guys know why do psychoanalysts answer every question with a question? Why wouldn't we? All right, so there were a number of comments, but they came across as clarifications, really just a marked response to what the patient was talking about, including her own idea that this was a very important thing to do. I had a category called chatting. Chatting is the death of good treatment, and I was looking for times I commented about the weather or sports or traffic, and I actually found 0 comments like this. And then I had to add a category called medications because, as you've seen, the patient was on psychotropic medications. All right. So what are neuropsychoanalytic interpretations? So in 60 hours, I ended up making 28 what I call neuropsychoanalytic interpretations. Craving is distressing. What does that mean? Well, there's another concept that Mark referred to earlier about drive reduction, that to really feel good, you both need to do what you want to do and also have some pleasure from it. And as Jaak indicated, the nature of electrical brain stimulation is animals will do it forever. There's no drive reduction there. So doing coke is very distressing because you do it and you feel better for a minute and then you want to do it again. The craving pathway is intensified by cigarettes. I won't discuss the empirical base of this, but there is very important animal and human research on this. Patients who are addicted to cocaine often complain of boredom, and this may have a neural basis. Their dopamine systems are downregulated. If you look in the retina and use a fluorescent dye to look at dopamine activity, it's half normal after a coke run. So since dopamine is the tuned into your environment, as Jaak said so nicely, you urgently want to see what's going on, be involved, be engaged, half your dopamine is missing. You don't have that feeling. You're bored, and this is one of the reasons that people do more cocaine, is it fixes their dopamine system very briefly. And they know this. They know they would feel better if they used it. At the time I was treating this patient, I had a beautiful Turkish carpet in my office, and the main color was white. The patient walked in one day and said, "Oh my God, you have all those white specks on your white carpet." Well, I kept my office pretty clean. I had never seen a white speck, but she was absolutely right. I never noticed them again. So the interpretation became that white specks had become extremely salient to the seeking system that includes the frontal areas that you saw in the diagram. She's looking for coke. She came into my office. She was looking for coke. I wasn't looking for coke, but she was able to show me what was salient in the environment. Her mother shamed her at a certain point about, my friend is dying from cancer. At least she can't help being sick. You can. And the suggestion was, no, your disorder is just as biological as your mother's friend with cancer. I listened, and she would associate from drugs to men constantly. Now, she did something that I had never heard of, but apparently it's widely done. You put out a message on the internet looking for a ski buddy. And she said mostly she would get replies from teenagers who wanted to go skiing with a girl, but there were certain middle-aged men who understood that this was code language for sex for cocaine. And they would respond, "I've got some coke, when will we meet?" So men and cocaine were joined in her thinking. And she described the beauty of, you know, if it's called flagging, this is idiomatic, but you put the syringe into your vein, and when you hit the vein, you can pull it back and you see the blood. And it's very exciting because it means the cocaine is about to go in. So I would imagine the people who don't use coke in this audience, you're thinking, you know, you're going to the hospital to get your blood drawn. The blood comes into the syringe and you go, "Oh, that's disgusting." But to her, it was the most exciting thing imaginable. And finally, she dreamed in hour 60 about her husband buying coke and injecting her with the coke. So all the way through this treatment, I didn't put all the number of times she had drug dreams, but she would have frequent dreams about cocaine, and this one included her husband. It was a beautiful description of how he was meant to impair her use of drugs, but his actual behavior was to facilitate it. All right, so what were the psychoanalytic interpretations? The most common one was boundaries. She would start to talk about herself, and then she would switch over and with great passion tell me what was wrong with her husband. There is an interesting thing that will happen if you listen to addicted patients. They'll talk, and they'll suddenly fall silent. And often they have started thinking about drugs. But they don't want to tell you because you were in the way of their using drugs, so you can ask, you know, what stopped your thinking? But you can also say, is there any chance you were thinking about using drugs? You'll often get a yes. There were other kinds of interpretations. The transference began to emerge as the treatment went on. And the patient had this controlling stepfather. She identified with her mother. One of the lovely things that her mother did as she was growing up is the mother would have boyfriends in addition to, you know, on the side with the stepfather. And since she wanted to keep her affairs a secret, she would have her boyfriends call on the children's telephone, have the children answer, and then have them get the mother when it was a boyfriend. So she was identifying with her mother. She was trying to get me to control her. We got to a certain point in the treatment where we agreed. I had already hospitalized her once. She'd been to Hazleton twice. She was going to have to decide if she wanted to stop cocaine or not. And she tried to get me to control her and lied to me, and this all got interpreted rather than acted on. This is an example of some things that were essentially clarifications, and there were some medication interpretations. So I hope you can see that there were neuroscience interpretations or neuropsychoanalytic interpretations, and there were psychoanalytic interpretations. Now, what's wrong with simply tuning into your patient empathically? Well, what's wrong with that in a case like this is your brain is not the same as your patient's. If you have not been addicted to cocaine, you don't know what they're going through in terms of the change in their brain. So you can't be a good therapist. Many times addicted patients will ask you, are you addicted? Have you ever done coke, doctor? And in part, I think what they would like to know is, can you empathically identify with what they're going through? And you can't. And that's okay, but you need to know that you're not able to do it. And if you don't understand, of course, there are many examples. I picked one about cocaine. If you don't understand how your patient's brain is different from yours, you're going to make a mistake. You're going to say, I don't understand why they're behaving like this. Why would anybody ever inject cocaine? That's bizarre. If you have the neuroscience, now you're thinking, at least, my patient has a brain disease. I've been trying to stay on a diet. I assume 100% of us have had the experience that it's very hard to be on a diet. Your brain invents all kinds of reasons that it would be great to eat this or that, even though it's probably not good for you. So one slide that I saw with Mark years ago, when Nora Volkov from the National Institute of Drug Abuse received the Neuropsychoanalysis Pfeffer Prize, was when they flashed a light and fed the rats, and flashed the light and fed the rats, and radio labeled their dopamine and flashed the light, and the rats were excited that food was coming, and they chopped off their heads. Jaak didn't mention this aspect of his work, but the dopamine in the seeking system had doubled. And then when they flashed the light and gave them coke, and flashed the light and gave them coke, and radio labeled their dopamine and flashed the light and chopped off their heads, the dopamine in the seeking system had gone up by 11 times. So chances are, as hard as it is to stay on a diet, staying off cocaine is so much more incredibly difficult. So now we're not addicted to cocaine, but we're using our understanding that the neural systems for seeking food and seeking drugs are identical. There may be a difference in quantity or quality, but it's kind of the same. Now you can start to empathically tune into what your patient is going through because you know the neuroscience. All right, so I love Otto Kernberg. I wouldn't pick on him if he wasn't the greatest guy. So I picked an article of his from the Journal of the American Psychoanalytic Association, where he's describing a cocaine-addicted patient in a completely different way. So here are some of his words. You have to differentiate the effect of the addiction from its dynamic function. The death instinct is active in these patients. Well, I have an article from the year before where I showed, I hope, that the death instinct couldn't possibly exist based on neuroscience, but here's Otto, who I've met and talked to, he's the greatest guy, explaining that addiction is activating the death drive. And then people who are narcissistic and they're grandiose and they use their addiction to rationalize their lack of success. So this is one view, but there's no neuroscience in Kernberg's work. All right, so what's the difference? I'm not differentiating the biological and addictive parts from anything else dynamically. They're all gamished together. So the interpretation about men, would it be that this woman with low self-esteem is desperately seeking to shore up her low self-esteem, abet her grandiosity by having affairs? No. Men are just drug cues. Just like you get into a certain neighborhood and you can't help but buy coke because it's so filled with drug cues that reverberate in that system that I told you about, for this woman, men were nothing but a drug cue. There was nothing about narcissism. Men equaled coke. So it wasn't that the death drive was super active in this patient. We go back to Jaak's 7 basic systems. the seeking system had now changed. It had mutated in a horrible way, and it was out of balance with care. All right, so was the patient rationalizing her lack of success by saying that she had addiction? No, this was a very intelligent, very capable woman with enormous potential who sadly had been abused since she was born and had gotten addicted to cocaine at age 15. And I think if you have this stance, then you empathically connect with your patient. You think, that could have been me. I mean, you know, we all come from a range of backgrounds. If you're a shrink, you probably had some problems. That's okay. You're working on them along with working with your patients. Hopefully, I use this model myself. We're all hopefully a little bit ahead of our patients in our own recovery. But you think, I could have been 15. You know, if things didn't work out the way they did, you know, maybe there was someone protective in your environment, maybe you were smart at school, so you didn't feel compelled to go into drugs. But you're talking to your patient and you're thinking, this could be me, as opposed to the Kernberg position, which seems so shaming. And the idea of cultural competence, on my service, I take every medical student and psychiatry resident to Alcoholics Anonymous as close to the beginning of the rotation as possible, and I pick a meeting where there's about as many women as men, because we have a lot of women trainees, and where people seem smart. They might be professors from our local college, and I want my medical students and residents to identify with the people in recovery and have exactly this thought. It could be me. All right, so I've basically covered this, and whatever the psychological reasons are, they don't go away. They are just intensified by the physical part of the addiction. Now we understand why patients with addiction are so incredibly difficult to treat. They started like this patient with a host of psychological problems, and then they tried to do that instant cure with drugs, and maybe it worked for a while, which means that they didn't develop the skills that all of us struggled so hard to develop. All right, so finally a couple more ideas. What about other treatments? A neuropsychoanalytic treatment, as you've seen, is completely compatible with 12-step recovery. There's no reason to argue. In fact, the question to ask your patient is, many people with good recovery go to Alcoholics Anonymous. Why wouldn't you? And you're really interested in the answer. The cognitive behavioral treatment model, it doesn't make any sense. It's a teaching model. If you read in the paper that goes along with this, I quote a wonderful cognitive behavioral expert in cocaine addiction, and the basic concept is if you can learn to use cocaine, you can learn not to use cocaine. 12 easy lessons. It doesn't make any sense. And finally, and I don't know how this is in Turkey, but there's a motivational enhancement treatment in the United States, which actually I find quite psychoanalytic. They won't discuss defense interpretation or transference interpretation, but they use many of the same techniques. It's a kind of a short-term treatment. It asks questions like, many people with good recovery go to AA, why wouldn't you? So finally, the raging debate in psychoanalysis that the relational psychoanalysts think that they have won at this point. You can't abandon a two-person model. Freud's old drive model has no relevance to patient treatment in 2012. It becomes silly once you know the neuroscience, because as Jaak showed so nicely, the neural systems are tuned to relatedness. So they both exist solely within the brains of each of us, and yet humans are social animals. If it was 10,000 years ago and you didn't get a signal from your panic system that being alone was not a good idea, you would have been eaten by saber-toothed tigers, which, I'm sorry, I'm just quoting Yak essentially. So there's a competition with other basic systems. Neuroscience should be the basic science of psychoanalysis, or maybe all of psychology. There has to be a material base. Again, I apologize, simply repeating what these two guys have said. And there's no reason that this should compete with any other school of psychology as if it's a different thing. It's just dual aspect monism. So that's my case. That's the application of neuropsychoanalysis to patient treatment. And thank you all for still being mostly awake at this point.
So we thank Dr. Brian Johnson so much, and we have, I think, 5 minutes for questions. Yes.
So I was wondering, what else do you do other than interpretation? Since we are talking about the affect, like what do you do when the patient brings up?
So how do we all get better? We all get better by being related. So what's wrong with drug addiction? It's actually an autistic behavior. One of my patients was in for his 100th alcohol detox. And I said to him, Jimmy, I see you out in front of Mass General Hospital every time I drive by, and you're sitting there with 4 friends and you're all drinking and laughing, and why don't you go to a nice halfway house and have some friends there? And his answer was, you know what? No one really listens to me. He actually was able to say that he knew his problem was he was unrelated. So if the patient comes in and they say, as they do sometimes, they will cry. The craving is so intense. I know what will happen if I use, and yet it is so hard not to use. Well, now we have a classic psychoanalytic conflict. They have a drive to do something that they know is going to hurt them, and they have a relationship along with you, and they may lose their relationship with you if they keep using their drug. Now, do you threaten them with that? No. You model helplessness. They are absolutely helpless about their urge to use cocaine. We use a lot of dream interpretation in our treatment. People come in with cocaine dreams. They'll complain about it. Oh my God, I was injecting coke. The blood flagged in the syringe. I was just about to inject and I woke up, is a typical drug dream. I'm so glad you told me. It's so hard to have this. It's such a struggle every day not to use your drug. You're absolutely helpless. There's not a thing that you can do for the patient. The worst, most unbearable feeling in the world is helplessness. And you've now shown your patient that you may not need to do any words. You show them that you can bear the helplessness that they are dealing with, and then you don't know what's going to happen. They may use, they may not use, they may live, they may die. This is the best we can do. Now, there are all kinds of interventions that are beyond the scope of this discussion, pharmacologic interventions that I have learned from Yak, actually. Doesn't have to do with cocaine. Well, it does, in part. I'll mention one. In the 20th century, disulfiram was widely used to help people with alcoholism. Disulfiram blocks acetaldehyde dehydrogenase. What does that mean? Alcohol is metabolized to acetaldehyde. Acetaldehyde is in the tiniest amounts in all of us, and then acetaldehyde dehydrogenase degrades that molecule to acetone, and it enters the Krebs cycle. You block that enzyme, and if you drink, you puke for about 6 hours, and then you're okay. So in our system will not allow you to come into treatment unless you bring a sober support person. So your mother, your husband, your child who's 20 needs to come, your AA sponsor needs to come and hear the whole story. We're forcing you to create a holding environment to start with. We'll ask that person to give disulfiram every day for the first year sober. So there's a pharmacologic intervention. In the 21st century, it's been found that disulfiram does a second thing. It inhibits dopamine decarboxylase. So dopamine is metabolized to norepinephrine. Dopamine makes you tuned in and related. Norepinephrine makes you anxious. You block that. It seems to have better outcomes. And besides, everyone knows you go to the bartender and after 3 drinks, you ask him, got any Coke back there? So Gokche is signaling me that we're out of time. Thanks very much. Best of luck.
Thank you so much. So I would like to invite Professor Panksepp and Professor Solms also here to present our gratitude to them with small gifts from Istanbul.